The vial vortices are an array of 12 triangular areas that span the earth, lying parallel and horizontal to one another according to ley lines. Within these areas occur the most unexplainable happenings. The most well-known of the vial vortices is the Bridgewater Triangle. Outside the major vial vortices, there are minor triangles where things just as strange have been known to occur, ones that may lie closer to you than you know. Tonight, we discuss the Hockomock Swamp portion of the Bridgewater Triangle of the Massachusetts coastline, just south of Boston, Massachusetts, and approximately 35 miles east of Providence, Rhode Island, lying there in the belly of Plymouth County. Yes, Plymouth as in the Plymouth Rock, the site of the first Pilgrim settlement in 1620. This is what lies within its county lines. Bridgewater lies along the Taunton River, which has several other rivers and brooks that branch off the main waterway. The river itself is home to a lot of biodiversity. It has a direct connection to the Atlantic Ocean, which warrants many marine species not typically found in rivers, such as harp seals, sharks, and a beluga whale. Over 260 plant species and 70 distinct species of fish lie within Taunton. If you are into the Fae, the biodiversity of the triangle will interest you, as the Fae are known for being in areas rich in animal and plant life. These beautiful ecosystems harbor certain enchantments when it comes to human beings. Within the Bridgewater Triangle also lie several other bodies of water, the largest of which is Lake Nipponicket along the western edge of the town. There is a state forest, a town forest, several conservation areas, and a large portion of the Hockomock Swamp Wildlife Management Area in the western part of town. Parts of this swamp give rise to the Bridgewater Triangle, a small area of concentrated reports of strange phenomena, colonial dark days, Bigfoot, and mysterious Black Panthers, UFO sightings, and other weird encounters. So weird, it leveled comparisons to the Bermuda Triangle itself, gaining it the title of the Bridgewater Triangle. Let's take a look at the land itself before European colonization. Let's take a look at its history, because most times the stories of the land tell just why the things that occur there that keep us up at night happen in the first place. The Bridgewater Triangle is an area of about 200 square miles, and its 3 points are the towns of Abington, Freetown, and Rehoboth. Within the triangle are the towns of Brockton, Taunton, the Bridgewaters, Rainham, Mansfield, Norton, and Easton. As far as research goes, Bridgewater was first inhabited by the Mattakeesit, Massachusetts, and the Mashpee Wampanoag indigenous. Although there is debate over which group encountered the colonists at Plymouth, some state that the Mattakeesit were but a smaller band of the Wampanoag. In contrast, others maintain that the two groups are separate. Each believes it was their own people who owned the land and that the colonists encroached upon it. The Wampanoag people have inhabited the land for the past 12,000 years. The Mattakeesit, Massachusetts are those whom the state of Massachusetts is said to be named after, with Massachusetts meaning at the Great Hill, referring to the blue hills that overlook Boston Harbor from the south. It is said that the first direct contact with a Native American was made in March 1621, and soon after, Wampanoag Chief Massasoit paid a visit to the settlement in Plymouth. After exchanging greetings and gifts, the two people signed a peace treaty that lasted for more than 50 years. When Massasoit died, his eldest son, Wamsuta, took over as chief, but unfortunately died soon afterward before Metacomet, also known as King Philip, in honor of the colonizer settlers. King Philip disapproved of the colonists' numbers and their overuse of natural resources, especially the draining of swamps to expand their farmland. These swamps being spoken of are those of which he and his people, the Wampanoag, held as sacred places. In 1675, a war broke out as the indigenous people sought to drive the English settlers out of the land for good. This war, known as King Philip's War, is named after the Wampanoag chief himself. Various other bands of indigenous people joined the Wampanoag to kill and run the English away. In the end, after 14 arduous months, King Metacomet Philip was kidnapped and then beheaded by the English colonizers, ending the war and scoring them a victory. Much of King Philip's War took place in Hockomock Swamp, and it is historically the bloodiest battle in U.S. or British history per capita, meaning the greatest percentage of the population died. 75 to 80% of the natives were wiped out, and 25% of the colonists were killed. For thousands of years, the indigenous have recognized the area as sacred, yet sometimes evil, sentient. Hush, little baby, don't say a word.
This is a conspiracy channel.
Welcome to the Hush Channel. According to cryptozoologist Lorraine Coleman's book Mysterious America, as of 1998, there were 2,635 places in the U.S. named after the devil. Amongst this list is Hockomock, the Algonquian indigenous word for devil. This term was used for 10 U.S. sites, 6 in Maine, 1 in New Jersey, 1 in Minnesota, and 2 in Massachusetts. One of the 2 in Massachusetts being the Hockomock Swamp in the Bridgewater Triangle. In a Depression-era Writers Project Administration Guide, the variant name for the Hockomock Swamp was Hokomoko, meaning evil spirit. The Hockomock Swamp extends throughout the entirety of the Bridgewater Triangle. During an expedition in Massachusetts, archaeologists came across an 8,000-year-old burial site on Grassy Island in Hockomock Swamp. I don't know why people think they can desecrate graves, especially graves of other ethnic groups, when they would likely never disrespect their own graves like that. But we've seen what they have done with Egypt and even other places where they open sarcophagi, build shopping centers atop burial grounds. So we know what their next thought process was upon coming across this ancient burial ground. The graves were opened. However, something came out. The red ochre, an earthy pigment containing ferric oxide, typically mixed with clay, ranging from light yellow to brown or red. This red ochre within the tombs began to bubble, then just dissolved mysteriously, and every single photograph taken of the site failed to develop. The Taunton River, which flows through the Bridgewater Triangle, has a watershed that actually includes the Hockomock Swamp. It is the longest coastal river in New England without dams, and also one of its flattest rivers, dropping only about 20 feet in elevation over its length. What is interesting about the Hockomock Swamp and the Bridgewater Triangle is that 30 miles up the Taunton River, at the edge of the Hockomock Swamp, is an area called Dighton Rock, where there is a 40-ton sandstone boulder, which has been the center of much debate when it comes to different ethnic groups claiming their people were the first pilgrims of the area. Dighton Rock sits on the riverbank directly across from the Grassy Island Indian burial grounds we just discussed. The rock is covered with a tangled pattern of carvings and hieroglyphs, and through these carvings, different ethnic groups have been able to create theories that support the idea that their people were there first. Groups like the Egyptians, Phoenicians, Vikings, and Portuguese, specifically. The Hockomock Swamp area is generally considered rough terrain. There are murky, infested pools, rivers, and quicksand, the likes of which should serve as a natural deterrent to humans. There is one thing I'd like to note, however. On a prior tape many nights ago, we discussed the migration of the Gaels, who now reside in the British Isles, a group of islands off the northwestern coast of mainland Europe that includes Ireland, Scotland, England, and Wales, along with surrounding islands such as the Hebrides, Orkney, and Shetland. These islands are divided between 2 modern states, the United Kingdom and the nation of Ireland. When speaking about the Gaels specifically, the focus is most strongly tied to Ireland and the Scottish Highlands, where Gaelic language and culture historically took root and developed. Scotland itself is often said in traditional narratives to take its name from Scotia, the figure tied to this lineage, and the identity of the land becomes directly connected to her story. Even the symbolism associated with Scotland, such as the lion on its flag, is often interpreted within these same traditions as a continuation of that lineage, with some accounts linking Scotia to a Lyran descent. Within these same lines of thought, Scotland and Ireland are also known for having some of the highest concentrations of red hair in Europe, a trait that has historically set people apart and at times led to them being viewed as different within broader European societies. Phineas Farset is described in later tradition as an early leader and progenitor of the Gaels, placed in the post-flood world within the broader sphere of Nimrod's rule, where he is said to have been established as a chieftain under that authority. He is also identified as a descendant of Japheth, situating his lineage within the early generations after Noah, and his domain is consistently associated with Scythia, a vast region of Central Asia known in ancient sources as a land of nomadic peoples and early cultural movement. In this framework, Phineas represents a bridge between the world of Babel under Nimrod and the later migrations outward, with Scythia serving as the geographic foundation from which his people would eventually disperse. Phineas Farseed had a son named Nile, and Nile married Scotia, the unnamed daughter of the Egyptian pharaoh of Exodus. Scotia is the only woman unnamed out of the 6 who were part of Moses' origin story. Scotia and Nile had a son named Go-Idel, who was raised alongside an adopted son known in the Bible as Moses. The Nile River was named after Nile, Phineas' son and Scotia's husband. While in Egypt, these people were called the Fine, named after their progenitor, Phineas Farseed. They remained there for 3 to 4 generations and were Hebrew sympathizers during a time when Egypt was subjecting or enslaving Hebrews. Because of this, the Fine were eventually expelled from Egypt. After their expulsion, they spread across the North African coastline and throughout the Mediterranean, including regions in Europe and the Levant, such as Portugal and Phoenicia. There, they reunited with the descendants of the Hebrews, forming alliances and continuing interbreeding that had already begun during their time in Egypt. By this point, the Hebrews themselves had become an even more mixed group than before their captivity, especially after generations spent in Egypt. After the Fine were expelled and the Hebrews liberated themselves from Egypt and Scotia's brother, the Hebrews moved into Canaan, claiming it as their divinely entitled land. Genocide. The Hebrews then gave the Fine a plot of land, naming it after Phineas Farseed, whose by name was Phanusa. This land became known as Phoenicia. Over time, a seafaring sect of these people migrated north from the Iberian Peninsula, the southwestern region of Europe that includes present-day Spain and Portugal, into Ireland, Scotland, and the British Isles. A portion of this group settled in Ireland, which becomes important later. By this stage, they had already interbred with indigenous Egyptians, ancient Canaanites, Hebrews, Berbers, other North Africans, and the various peoples along the Mediterranean coastline. Over time, this blending of cultures led to the formation of what became known collectively as the Phoenician world, with syncretic traditions emerging across generations. All of this considered, the markings of Dighton Rock could have come from the Gaels, who by that point were a people shaped by Egyptian, Phoenician, Viking, and Iberian influences. The Phoenicians, known as master seafarers, also made one of the most significant contributions to writing systems, which still influence us today. Despite this, they are not commonly recognized as a distinct named group in popular history. Some of the Gaels later became Vikings, so it follows that if these people traveled to the Americas, Dighton Rock would reflect that history. In short, they left Scythia, migrated to Egypt, lived there for generations, were expelled, moved into Crete, and then divided into separate groups to increase their chances of survival and expansion. Those groups spread across the Mediterranean, including Crete and the Iberian Peninsula, established Phoenicia, became so-called sea peoples, and eventually migrated into the British Isles, particularly Ireland and Scotland. From there, Gaels became Vikings alongside Scandinavian, Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish groups. So if these same people reached the Americas, it would make sense for Dighton Rock to carry markings tied to that lineage.
In the old days, a custom laid aside with breeches and cocked hats, the people sent their wisest men to make the public laws. And so, from a brown homestead, where the sound drinks, the small tribute of the Mianas, waved over by the woods of Rippowams, and hallowed by pure lives and tranquil deaths, Stamford sent up to the councils of the state wisdom and grace in Abraham Davenport. 'Twas on a May day of the far old year, 1780, that there fell over the bloom and sweet life of the spring, over the fresh earth and the heaven of noon, a horror of great darkness like the night, in day of which the Norland sagas tell, the twilight of the gods. The low-hung sky was black with ominous clouds, save where its rim was fringed with a dull glow, like that which climbs the crater's sides from the red hell below. Birds ceased to sing, and all the barnyard fowls roosted. The cattle at the pasture bars lowed and looked homeward. Bats on leathern wings flitted abroad. The sounds of labor died, men prayed, and women wept. All ears grew sharp to hear the doom blast of the trumpet shatter the black sky, that the dreadful face of Christ might look from the rent clouds, not as he looked, a loving guest at Bethany, but stern as justice and inexorable law. Meanwhile, in the old State House, dim as ghosts, sat the lawgivers of Connecticut, trembling beneath their legislative robes. "It is the Lord's great day. Let us adjourn," some said. And then, as if with one accord, all eyes were turned to Abraham Davenport. He rose, slow cleaving with his steady voice the intolerable hush. "This well may be the day of judgment which the world awaits. But be it so or not, I only know my present duty and my Lord's command to occupy till he come. So at the post where he has set me in his providence, I choose for one to meet him face to face. No faithless servant frightened from my task, but ready when the Lord of the harvest calls. And therefore, with all reverence I would say, let God do his work, we will see to ours. Bring in the candles." And they brought them in. Then by the flaring lights the speaker read, albeit with husky voice and shaking hands, "An act to amend an act to regulate the shad and alewife fisheries." Whereupon wisely and well spake Abraham Davenport, straight to the question, with no figures of speech, save the 10 Arab signs, yet not without the shrewd dry humor natural to the man. His awestruck colleagues listening all the while, between the pauses of his argument, to hear the thunder of the wrath of God break from the hollow trumpet of the cloud. And there he stands in memory to this day, erect, self-poised, a rugged face, half seen against the background of unnatural dark. A witness to the ages as they pass, that simple duty hath no place for fear. This excerpt comes from John Greenleaf Whittier, a poet, editor, and son of 2 Quakers, quoted from the tent on the beach, an excerpt to recount the dark day of 1780.
At dawn on Friday, May 19th, 1780, farmers in New England stopped to marvel at the ominous pink hue of the sun. This was not limited to one town or one colony. It was reported across Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and parts of Maine, with especially strong accounts coming out of Hartford, Connecticut, Boston, and Essex County, Massachusetts, and Portsmouth, New Hampshire. The light did not behave naturally. It rose dim and discolored, casting a strange yellow and reddish tint over the land. By noon, the sky had darkened to midnight blackness, not in patches like a storm, but across entire regions at once. In Hartford, witnesses said it became so dark that people could not see to read without candlelight. In Boston, shops closed early and daily activity stopped completely. Americans, still in the throes of a protracted war of independence, lit candles in the middle of the day and trembled at thoughts of the Last Judgment. As the birds quieted and no storm accompanied the darkness, men and women crowded into churches across these colonies, particularly in rural Massachusetts towns, where religious interpretation was strongest. The people were very attentive, burning candles from noon until the next night, in utter fear, horror, believing it possible never to see the light of day again, believing Judgment Day was possibly upon them. There in the darkness, men prayed and women wept. All ears grew sharp to hear the doom blast of the trumpet shatter across the black sky. A yellow day or dark day is a phenomenon that occurs more in New England than anywhere else, particularly in the dense forest regions of the Northeast where atmospheric conditions can trap smoke and moisture. It is a time when the daytime becomes unusually dark. sometimes shifting into yellow, orange, or near black tones. Scientists and researchers have their theories, but even they are not 100% certain as to why it occurs in such an extreme and widespread way when it does. Sounds like the veil's thin and the fade world or other dimensions opens up to me, but maybe I'm pushing it. Maybe not. The most famous instance remains that of May 19th, 1780. Several days prior, the sun showed red and the sky yellow across multiple locations, including eastern Massachusetts and coastal New Hampshire, where maritime observers also noted the unusual coloration over the Atlantic horizon. By sunrise on the 19th, the sun was already obscured and darkness set in between 10 and 11 a.m., first reported heavily in western Massachusetts and Connecticut, before spreading across the rest of New England. The darkness persisted into the next night. Roosters crowed, woodcocks whistled, and frogs peeped as if night had fallen at 2 p.m. Farmers in Essex County reported their chickens going to roost hours early, while in New Haven County, Connecticut, cattle gathered at pasture gates and attempted to return to barns. A strong, sooty smell pervaded the air, noted in diaries from Massachusetts residents, and rainwater carried a film of particles from burnt leaves and ash, visible in collected water basins. Some accounts describe this residue settling visibly on surfaces, reinforcing the sense that something physical, not just visual, was falling from the sky. Come actual night, the moon showed itself red in the sky, observed across Massachusetts and Rhode Island, its light dimmed and distorted. Since the very first colonists recorded a dark day on October 21st, 1716, also noted in New England records, there have been multiple dark days in the region, including the well-documented May 19th, 1780. What makes the 1780 event stand apart is not just that it happened, but the scale, the duration, and the psychological impact it had across multiple colonies at once. It is believed to be caused by the smoke of extensive forest fires, most likely burning in what is now Ontario, Canada, with the smoke carried southeast into New England and trapped under specific atmospheric conditions. When a fire does not kill a tree and the tree continues to grow, scar marks are left in the tree's growth rings. Researchers studying tree rings in eastern North America have identified fire scars dating to around 1780, which appear to align with the timing of the dark day. This supports the wildfire theory, suggesting that massive fires combined with dense fog and cloud cover created the conditions necessary for such an extreme darkening of the sky. As stated previously, however, researchers are not 100% certain. It remains the strongest explanation, but not a fully closed case. Lacking the ability to communicate quickly over long distances, Americans in 1780 remained both literally and figuratively in the dark about the event. Someone in Connecticut had no way of knowing if the same thing was happening in Massachusetts or beyond. This isolation intensified the fear, making the event feel localized and personal, like the sky had darkened specifically over them. The darkness dissipated by the next day, restoring normal light, but leaving confusion behind. Over the following months, newspapers in cities like Boston and Hartford carried vigorous debates about the cause. Some explanations leaned toward natural causes, while others were rooted in prophecy and religious interpretation. One account claimed that a blazing star had passed between the earth and the sun, blocking its light. This idea reflects how people tried to make sense of something they had no framework for. And interestingly, when looking at locations like the Hockomock Swamp, an area historically associated with unexplained phenomena, reports of strange lights continue into modern times. The swamp lies within what is often called the Bridgewater Triangle, and sightings of unexplained glowing orbs or fire-like lights have been reported for generations, including movements observed from areas like the Rainham dog track through the swamp. While not directly tied to the dark day, it adds another layer to the region's long-standing reputation for unexplained atmospheric and visual phenomena. And now we proceed to the Taunton State Hospital, also known as the State Lunatic Hospital at Taunton, or Taunton State Lunatic Hospital, the place that spawns the stories of American Horror Story's second season. The asylum. Yes, Taunton State Hospital is located in Taunton, Massachusetts. The city itself is actually considered the exact center, or the heart of the Bridgewater Triangle. Taunton is a city in Bristol County, Massachusetts, within the Bridgewater Triangle, and it is home to almost the entire Massasoit State Park and a large portion of the Hockomock Swamp. It was settled by a majority of pilgrims from Somerset, England on September 3rd of 1639, after being purchased from the Nemaska indigenous in 1637. The natives who originally lived on the land relocated to Ponkapoag and present-day Canton, Massachusetts. When Plymouth Colony was formally divided into counties on June 2nd of 1685, Taunton became the stronghold of the traditional culture of Bristol County and later transferred to the province of Massachusetts Bay on May 14th of 1692. The area has been the site of skirmishes and battles during various conflicts, including King Philip's War and the American Revolution. On October 21st, 1652, the Pilgrims found out that there were large amounts of bog ore in the area. Bog ore, or iron, is a form of impure iron deposit that develops in bogs or swamps by the chemical or biochemical oxidation of iron carried in solution. Based on these findings, the residents of Taunton voted to establish an ironworks. They invited three brothers, Henry Leonard, James Leonard, and Ralph Russell, to set up shop along the 2 Mile River to help establish the ironworks. These three brothers had experience after success at Braintree Furnace in the coastal city of Quincy, Massachusetts, just around 30 miles north of Massachusetts, where the Braintree Furnace was built along a stream that originated in the Blue Hills of the Appalachian Mountains. Taunton Ironworks operated for 220 years until 1876. It was during this time that Taunton became known as the Silver City, home to many silversmiths. Taunton did not have natural silver deposits. The silver associated with the city was imported rather than mined locally. Unlike the bog iron found in its swamps during the 17th century, silver had to be brought in from other regions, including major mining areas in the western United States, Mexico, and other sources where raw or refined silver was available. What made Taunton known as the Silver City was not access to silver in the ground, but its role as a major center for manufacturing and production. By the 19th century, the city had already developed a strong industrial base through its ironworks, along with a skilled workforce, established trade routes via the Taunton River, and later railroad connections. This infrastructure allowed companies like Reed and Barton and F.B. Rogers to thrive, transforming imported silver into finished goods such as fine silverware, decorative pieces, and silver-plated items that were distributed across the country. The nickname Silver City reflects this industrial identity, not a place where silver was found, but a place where it was refined, crafted, and turned into products that defined its economic and cultural legacy. Taunton became an epicenter of the iron-making industry by utilizing the bog iron in the area, and it had a large textile and grain industry. At the same time, the Taunton River was a major shipping point for exporting goods to the rest of the country. When the railroad system was established, the city also became an important transportation hub due to its central location. In the year 1851, the Massachusetts General Court issued a commission to find a site for a new asylum to relieve the pressure on the state's then only asylum, the Worcester Insane Asylum, which had opened 18 years prior on January 12th of 1833. It was April 1854 as the doors of the State Lunatic Hospital at Taunton opened for the first time, ushering in a new era of mental health care in Massachusetts. For centuries, the mentally ill were misunderstood and often mistreated, but the construction of the second asylum in the state sought to change that, tallying up a bill of $151,742. This is a tale of beautiful architecture, chilling stories, and a haunted past. The State Lunatic Hospital at Taunton was situated on a picturesque 154-acre plot of land, surrounded by lush forest and rolling hills. The serene landscape provided a tranquil setting for the patients, who were encouraged to spend time outdoors and engage in activities such as gardening and farming. The grounds also included walking paths, park benches, and gazebos where patients could relax and enjoy nature's beauty. It sat riverside on the Mill River in Taunton, which served as a natural barrier between the asylum and the ever-growing town at the time. Its campus was designed by architect Elbridge Boyden, who was known for his exceptional work in Gothic Revival architecture and had a track record by then for his designs in civic structures such as post offices, jails, courthouses, and railroad systems. Bowden added his own touch to the campus using his signature cornices, capitals, and cupolas, and the State Lunatic Hospital at Taunton's grounds would continue to grow from the 1870s to the 1930s. The hospital was initially built to accommodate 200 patients, but its capacity was soon expanded due to the growing demand for mental health care in the region. Over the years, the hospital underwent several renovations and expansions, transforming it into a sprawling complex with numerous buildings and facilities. The campus grew to encompass 40 buildings, including a basketry, staff dormitories, the chapel, laundry, theater, kitchens, juvenile facilities, crisis centers, sick wards, group homes, dining rooms, parlors, open-air verandas, and modernized to have running water, a sewer system, central heat, and central ventilation, as it was renovated to uphold physician Thomas Story Kirkbride's standardized plan for asylums, in which large wings stretched out from a central administrative structure in a design that was meant to maximize sunlight and fresh air to each and every ward. The building was to be curative, and its grounds were to make it a place fitted to interest and tranquilize the minds of those in need. The dome over the 3-story administrative building towered 70 feet above the roof. It gave a panoramic view of the center's beauty, embracing the neighboring town with its many tokens of busy life and flourishing villages, numerous ponds, and streams with which the surrounding county flourished, with reaching veins up to the Blue Hills of Norfolk County, Virginia. The State Lunatic Hospital at Taunton was a masterpiece of Gothic Revival architecture. Its grand facade featured pointed arches, intricate stone carvings, and lofty towers that seemed to reach for the heavens. The hospital's exterior was constructed primarily of brick and stone, with large windows that allowed sunlight to stream into the patient rooms and common areas. The hospital's interior was equally impressive, with high ceilings, ornate woodwork, and elegant fixtures. The wards were designed to provide patients with a sense of comfort and tranquility, featuring soft colors, plush furnishings, and artwork adorning the walls. Despite its beauty, it was an asylum after all, and in addition to its marvelous renovations and design, it included window bars. Its idyllic setting also bore witness to the darker aspects of life at the hospital. The surrounding woods, while providing a peaceful escape for some, also served as the backdrop for escape attempts, tragic accidents, and tales of hauntings and eerie occurrences. The thing is, it did not take much to be classified as mentally unsound and committed to an insane asylum in those times. Promiscuity, forgetfulness, being young, wild, and too free, liberal, having anxiety, being depressed, being a black sheep and not getting along with your family, being gay, being a woman and too assertive, being too outspoken, too unorthodox, not being man enough, being too hyper, having a birth defect, Alzheimer's, having syphilis, speaking poor English, having poor social skills, being too quiet, too reserved, being antisocial, depressed, having autism, having anxiety, being caught masturbating, being a troubled immigrant, especially Irish. These were all reasons a person would be committed an insane asylum. They had no say in when or even if they would ever be able to leave either. The asylum at Taunton was essentially a prison dressed as a prestigious college university for nonconformists. However, there were those committed who belonged there, but there were also those who were simply humans experiencing humanity naturally during the wrong era. In 1869, a man named David Hurley lost both of his legs while trying to leap from a train that was taking him to the Taunton Asylum. Very little is recorded about Hurley himself. No detailed biography, no clear diagnosis, no preserved account explaining why he had been committed. Like many people of that era, he exists in the record almost entirely through the incident that ended his life. During the 19th century, commitment to a state hospital could happen quickly and for a wide range of reasons, from severe mental illness to emotional distress, neurological conditions, alcoholism, or behavior that families could not manage. At the time, Taunton operated under what was known as the Kirkbride Plan, a system that claimed architecture, fresh air, and strict routine could restore mental health. Patients were transported, often by train, to institutions like Taunton, where they would be admitted into a system they had little control over once inside. Somewhere along that journey, Hurley made a decision. Whether it was fear, confusion, or a moment of clarity about what awaited him, he tried to escape before ever arriving. He jumped from the moving train and the fall crushed his legs beneath it, severing them completely. He died not long afterward, reportedly within about half an hour to an hour of the accident. He never made it inside the hospital, and that detail matters because it shows that for some people, the idea of Taunton was already terrifying enough that death felt like the only way out. Taunton State Hospital housed many notable patients over the years, including some who became infamous for violent or shocking crimes. Among the most well-documented was Jane Toppin, later known as Jolly Jane. She was born Honora Kelly to Irish immigrant parents and had a deeply unstable childhood marked by poverty and institutionalization. She was eventually taken in by the Toppin family, whose name she adopted, and trained as a nurse in Massachusetts. On the surface, she was charismatic, attentive, and considered unusually skilled with patients. Behind that exterior, however, she began experimenting with lethal drug combinations. Toppin used mixtures of morphine and atropine to poison patients, carefully adjusting doses to observe how the body responded. She confessed to 31 murders, though many historians suspect the number may have been significantly higher. What made her especially disturbing was not just that she killed, but how she described it. She spoke about lying in bed with her victims as they died, holding them and watching the moment life left their bodies. It was not impulsive. It was controlled, deliberate, and in her own words, driven by a desire to experience death up close. She stated that her goal was to kill more helpless people than any man or woman who had ever lived. In 1902, after being exposed, she was found not guilty by reason of insanity and committed to Taunton State Hospital, where she remained until her death in 1938. There was also 23-year-old W.H. Prey, whose case reflects a different kind of disturbance, one rooted not in visible chaos but in emotional detachment. Prey was committed after murdering a 3-year-old child, Werner M. Fisher. When questioned, his reasoning was disturbingly simple. He reportedly said he liked attending funerals. There were additional factors, including resentment toward the child's older brother, who had bullied him, but even that does not fully account for the act. What stands out is the absence of emotional response. This was not described as a crime of rage or panic, but something quieter and more unsettling, a fixation carried out without clear remorse. Following a lunacy inquiry, Prey was ordered to Taunton, where individuals like him were placed into the same environment as patients who may have been suffering from grief, anxiety, or conditions that today would be treated very differently. Among them was Anthony Santo, a case that further blurs the line between illness and violence. Santo was only about 14 years old when he confessed to killing multiple children, including members of his own family. Reports from the time suggested that after suffering from scarlet fever, he began experiencing hallucinations and delusions. Scarlet fever is a bacterial illness caused by Streptococcus, the same group of bacteria responsible for strep throat. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, before antibiotics, it was far more dangerous than it is today. It often presented with a high fever, a bright red rash that spread across the body, a sore throat, and what doctors described as a strawberry tongue. In some cases, especially in children, the infection could lead to complications affecting the brain, including inflammation, confusion, and behavioral changes. While not every case caused long-term damage, there were instances where survivors were believed to experience lasting neurological or psychological effects, which is how Santo's condition was interpreted at the time. He described being driven by visions or internal forces he could not control. Physicians concluded that his mind had been severely affected and that he was not acting with full awareness or intent in a rational sense. He was committed to Taunton, where he became one of the youngest individuals absorbed into a system that did not distinguish clearly between adult offenders and mentally ill children. Unlike someone like Toppin, Santo was not described as calculating or experimental. He was described as fractured, a child whose mind had broken spoken in a way that the medical understanding of the time could not properly address. Among these individuals, many high-profile offenders and deeply troubled patients would pass through Taunton, mixed in with people who had other mental illnesses, neurological conditions, or were not insane in any modern sense at all. That mixture is what defines the hospital's history. It was not simply a place for the criminally dangerous, nor solely a place of care. It was a system where people who chose violence, people who could not control it, and people who were simply misunderstood or inconvenient were all placed together under one roof. There was little separation and even less understanding of what each person actually needed. That is what gives Taunton its weight. The horror was not only in the acts committed by individuals, but in the environment that held them all together, where very different kinds of suffering were confined to the same space and left to coexist. It was essentially a prison for those deemed insane, whether they actually were or not. Escape attempts were not uncommon at Taunton State Hospital, though the reasons behind them are often more complex than simple accounts of abuse suggest. Like many large 19th and early 20th century psychiatric institutions, Taunton operated as a closed, controlled environment where patients had limited freedom of movement and, in many cases, no clear timeline for release. This alone created conditions where patients would attempt to leave, whether due to fear, confusion, disagreement with their confinement, or a desire to return home. Architecturally, the hospital followed the Kirkbride plan, which emphasized long extended wings, segmented wards, and strict internal organization. While this design was originally intended to promote order and recovery, it also created a structure that could feel maze-like and difficult to navigate. It provided the illusion of freedom. Patients who attempted escape would have had to move through multiple layers of supervision, locked doors, and monitored spaces before ever reaching the outside. In some cases, individuals did manage to leave the building or grounds, but most attempts were short-lived as patients were typically identified and returned by staff or local authorities. Once returned, patients could face disciplinary measures, though these were generally framed at the time as behavioral management rather than punishment in the modern sense. Historical practices across state hospitals, including Taunton, included increased supervision, restriction of movement, or placement in more controlled wards. In earlier periods, methods such as mechanical restraints or seclusion were also used, particularly for patients considered a risk to themselves or others. While these measures were standard for the era, they often contributed to the perception of the institution as oppressive or punitive. Documented individual escape stories from Taunton are relatively sparse compared to the broader record of institutional practices, but the pattern of attempted departure is well established in psychiatric history overall. Large state hospitals across the United States routinely reported patient elopements, and Taunton operated within that same system. The scale of the institution, housing hundreds of patients at various points in its history, made complete containment difficult, especially before modern security systems. Over time, these incidents of attempted escape, combined with the hospital's size, isolation, and evolving reputation, became part of its local lore. Stories began to take on more dramatic elements, describing patients fleeing into surrounding woods or navigating endless corridors in search of an exit. While not all of these accounts can be verified as specific events, they reflect a broader truth about the experience of institutionalization. For many patients, the hospital represented a place they could not easily leave. These stories of escape and resistance have since become embedded in Taunton's cultural memory, contributing to its reputation as a place of both confinement and unease. Whether rooted in documented incidents or expanded through retelling, they add another layer to the hospital's legacy, one shaped not only by treatment and care, but by the persistent tension between control and the desire for freedom. At the turn of the 20th century, eugenics entered the equation. Eugenics is the study of how to arrange reproduction within a human population to increase the occurrence of heritable characteristics regarded as desirable. Developed largely by Sir Francis Galton as a method of improving the human race, eugenics was increasingly discredited. Later, it was considered unscientific and racially biased during the 20th century, especially after the adoption of its doctrine doctrines by the Nazis to justify their treatment of Jews, disabled people, and other minority groups, specifically black people. It was racist, and a practice that, despite its alienation of black people, really only stopped after World War II because the white people of America saw the European Jew targets of Hitler as their skinfolk and wasn't standing for discrimination of them. It was not stopped because of sympathy for black people, just like the Civil War was not over Lincoln really wanting to free black people. Sounds good though. And as we can tell in more recent years, it has not actually stopped. It has been rebranded and disguised via microaggressions. Medical microaggressions. That's a whole other horror story of its own. However, given the era, scientific thinking in the United States had begun to shift toward ideas rooted in eugenics, the belief that certain people were more fit, more valuable, and more deserving of life and reproduction than others. These ideas quietly shaped institutions across the country, including psychiatric hospitals like Taunton. While not every policy was explicitly labeled as eugenic, the influence showed in how people were categorized, treated, and ultimately confined. Taunton, which began as the State Lunatic Hospital and was later renamed Taunton State Hospital, gradually became less of a place of recovery and more of a place of containment. What had once been envisioned under the Kirkbride Plan as a healing environment of light, air, and order began to collapse under the weight of overcrowding. Patients were admitted faster than they could be treated, and the institution increasingly functioned as a holding space for those society labeled as undesirable, the mentally ill, the neurologically impaired, the socially disruptive, the poor, and those who simply did not fit within expected norms. As overcrowding intensified, conditions declined. The hospital became difficult to maintain, and individualized care gave way to routine management. Within that environment, patients were subjected to forms of treatment that were considered progressive at the time but are now widely recognized as invasive, harmful, and often inhumane. Comas were deliberately induced through insulin shock therapy, pushing the body into extreme physiological states in hopes of resetting mental function. Hydrotherapy was used extensively, placing patients in tubs of extremely hot or cold water for prolonged periods, sometimes for hours, and in certain cases, extended durations meant to calm or restrain rather than heal. Electroconvulsive therapy introduced controlled seizures in an attempt to alter brain activity, while lobotomies severed connections in the frontal lobe to reduce symptoms of severe mental illness. In the most infamous form of the procedure, instruments were inserted through the orbital cavity above the eye to access the brain, permanently altering cognition, personality, and behavior. These treatments were framed as medical advancement, yet many patients were left permanently damaged, institutionalized for life, or unable to function outside the system that confined them. Death within the institution was not uncommon, especially as patient populations grew and resources stretched thin. Over time, many individuals who entered Taunton never left, and their identities faded into the system. Burial practices reflected that erasure. Hundreds of individuals connected to the hospital were interred in nearby grounds with numbered markers instead of names, reducing entire lives to anonymous records. The hospital, in practice, became a place where people could be removed from society indefinitely, their existence contained and in many cases forgotten. As such, the surrounding grounds of the asylum are a nesting place for Satanists wishing to perform rituals to harvest the negative energy garnered from pain and suffering on the campus. The accumulation of decades of confinement, treatment, and loss has made the site a focal point for darker interpretations, where the physical history of the institution blends with ongoing legend and belief. In 1975, the main Kirkbride section of the asylum was closed and abandoned, marking the end of its original architectural era, though parts of the broader hospital campus continued to operate. In 1999, the building's central dome, once a defining feature of the structure, collapsed, symbolizing the physical decay of the institution. On March 19, 2006, a massive fire broke out in the center of the building, engulfing the administration and theater sections. The damage from the fire led to those areas being demolished, and by 2009, the remaining wings of the Kirkbride building were systematically torn down, with demolition completed by 2010. What remains now is not the structure itself, but the imprint it left behind, a site shaped by reform, overcrowding, experimentation, and the long-lasting consequences of a system that struggled to distinguish between care and control. Following the fire and eventual demolition of the historic Kirkbride building, the structure was not simply left to decay in place. Portions of the building's materials were salvaged during and after demolition, including granite, brick, timber, and other architectural elements typical of large 19th century institutional construction. These materials were either recycled, repurposed, or otherwise removed as part of the demolition process, which was completed between 2009 and early 2010. While it is commonly stated that items such as fixtures, gates, and interior elements were widely sold off, documentation more reliably supports that the site underwent a structured demolition and material recovery process rather than a fully cataloged nationwide resale of all interior components. Despite the loss of the original Kirkbride structure, the Taunton State Hospital campus itself did not close. In 2012, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts invested approximately $19 million in capital improvements to modernize the remaining operational portions of the facility. These upgrades were part of a broader effort to shift away from large, outdated institutional models towards smaller, regulated, and treatment-focused environments. Today, Taunton State Hospital remains an active psychiatric facility, though significantly reduced in size compared to its historical peak. The hospital operates with a limited number of inpatient psychiatric beds, commonly cited at around 48 beds, serving adults in need of structured, secure mental health care. The campus also supports specialized programs, including services related to substance use, treatment, and recovery. While program offerings can evolve over time, facilities like Taunton have included targeted services such as women's recovery programs and other behavioral health initiatives. Therapeutic and occupational programming has also been part of modern psychiatric care approaches, and hospital campuses such as Taunton have included structured activities designed to support rehabilitation and routine. Greenhouse or horticultural programs have been associated with psychiatric facilities as a form of therapeutic engagement, though the extent of public-facing sales and specific program details may vary over time and are not always consistently documented in official summaries. Today, the State Lunatic Hospital at Taunton stands as a layered site of both progress and legacy. It reflects the evolution of mental health care, from large-scale institutionalization to more regulated and patient-centered treatment, while still carrying the weight of its past. The original structure is gone, but the history remains embedded in the grounds, serving as both a record of how far psychiatric care has come and a reminder of the systems that once defined it. As one might expect from a place with such a dark history, Taunton State Hospital has been the subject of countless ghost stories and paranormal encounters. Former patients, staff members, and visitors have reported eerie occurrences such as unexplained noises, apparitions, and feelings of dread. Some of the most famous ghost stories involve the spirit of a young girl who roams the halls, seeking the comfort of her mother, and the ghost of a former nurse who continues to make her rounds, tending to the long-vanished patients. Here is something I want you to think about. All the iron ore found and further utilized and industrialized in the area of Taunton we spoke of earlier. In addition to Taunton being the heart of the Bridgewater Triangle, I did not go into such details without reason. In folklore, iron has long been believed to ward off spirits and repel the likes of the fae, witches, ghosts, and capture hags and jinn alike. This belief is seen in the Hindu Vedas, the oldest manuscripts of Hinduism, and Hinduism is the oldest known standing religion to date, at over 4,000 years old. In fact, in Tibet, they use meteoric iron to create ritualistic tools, such as their singing bowls. Meteoric iron, also called sky iron, is a native metal found in meteorites and is composed of the elements iron and nickel. It is said to be the supreme substance for forging the physical representation of the Vajra or other iron weapons, since the celestial gods have already tempered it in its passage across the heavens. Many weapons of the Hindu gods were forged from meteoric iron, which they sometimes used to inflict pain on humans and even on each other in the War of the Vedas between the gods. A war that has left nuclear evidence in lost cities now found, like Mohenjo-Daro, where scientists wonder how radiation got into the area. The Vedas tell of a war of the worlds between the gods happening that would be the obvious answer. So the fact that iron and higher entities and or even demonic entities seem to be affected by iron suggests that there is more to this than just myth. In one way or another, we have all heard of such stories. King Solomon captured jinn, or their plural form, genies, in iron lamps and containers, as in extra-canonical biblical stories and in the Arabian Nights, which are the oldest stories known to mankind. Some believe some of its tales may be old enough to have been read to the children of Noah on the ark. There is the notion of nailing an iron horseshoe to a door to repel evil spirits, which later became a notion to bring good luck. Surrounding a cemetery with an iron fence was believed to contain the souls of the dead within the cemetery. 2. The cemetery. Burying an iron knife under the entrance of one's home was believed to keep witches from entering. In the Bible, in Judges 1:19, God was unable to lead the nation of Judah to victory against the valley men because they had chariots of iron. And the Lord was with Judah, and he drove out the inhabitants of the mountain, but could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley because they had chariots of iron. When you think of the God of the Bible, you think of the God of gods. And without the fallacies and weaknesses other gods and deities fall subject to. This verse, however, tells a different story. Iron mixed with larger amounts of carbon is called steel, and steel was once rare. Hence, steel workers were often associated with supernatural skill, that is, until the Industrial Revolution, which occurred from around 1760 to 1840. I would wage that the mass production of iron and steel, not just in America, but across the world, unbalanced the spirits, perhaps angered some, causing them to react negatively to humans. Of course, they would be considered demonic threats to us. It is quite possible, however, that they are actually trying to scare humans from entering certain territories as to keep them from placing more iron in the area. There is always a light and dark hand, sort of like the U.S. government poses as good guys, but the CIA does the so-called necessary dirty work to get things done, things that are technically morally evil. Humans learned this from somewhere, and on this channel, all these beings, whether you call them angels, fallen angels, mythological creatures, gods, spirits, demons, so forth, they are and were originally the Anunnaki, subspecies of the Anunnaki, enslaved species of the Anunnaki, and children of the Anunnaki that they had with humans and animals alike, as stated in the Book of Giants. So it is possible that both so-called good and evil purebred spirits were warded off. Still, the children of these spirits were more resilient, more resistant, and refused to be run off their lands by humans in their place, leaving an imbalance, creating a vortex such as the Bridgewater Triangle. Some of these children spirits in their original lives were faced with prejudice by humans because of how they came to be through the mixing of species. This type of prejudice led them to hating humans, maybe not their human mother, but other humans, of course, they were wary of, and so, of course, some humanity viewed them as evil. Some of humanity saw them as mistakes, disgusting as well. These are the beings spoken of in the Bible, where it is said the giants grew more evil by the generation. However, it does not detail the other side of the story, as is detailed in the tapes on this channel through extra-canonical and historical textual studies. If it is hard to imagine that, think about how some people, even today, view racial mixing, and if you are a listener of mixed heritage that spawns such discrepancy and prejudice, it may hit you even harder. The point is, God cursed these half-breeds and quarter-breeds to become demons upon death instead of ascending. This was the origin of demons in the Book of Giants. They would likely be less affected by iron than their purebred angelic Anunnaki alien parent. I say alien because the Anunnaki were not from Earth. The gods of the religions of Earth are not from Earth. They descended here, so they are technically aliens. With that being said, the hatred some of these beings faced when they walked amongst the living is enough to make them malevolent forces. The iron likely warded off good purebreds, as well as evil. These beings had their own individuality, just like humans can be good or bad, not innately and monolithically one or the other. That being said, not all hybrid children were evil. The fallen angels weren't evil either, and I have discussed this in full depth. It's a matter of the enemy being the hero in their own story and to their own kind, and those they fight for are the champions and heroes of their story. The victor of such a circumstance writes history. A hero to one is not a hero to all. There are different sides in conflict for a reason. Still, this tussle of energy and the strange phenomena that happen in certain areas becomes a thing. In Fae lore, the likes of the American Revolution are believed to have separated the spiritual and human worlds further apart, creating a disconnect because iron is literally everywhere in today's time, unearthed, concentrated, and built into everything. Who's to say that the Industrial Revolution did not have another agenda that included subduing such entities? Two birds, one stone. Iron is the most abundant element by mass in Earth, constituting about 80% of the inner and outer cores of Earth. The surface of the planet where we live is called the crust. It is a very thin layer, assumed to be about 43.5 miles or 70 kilometers thick. The fraction of iron that is in Earth's crust only amounts to about 5% of the mass of the crust, placing it as the foremost abundant element in the crust following oxygen, silicon, and aluminum. Base metals are common and inexpensive naturally occurring metals, as opposed to precious metals such as gold or silver, which are more rare. Iron is a base metal alongside copper, zinc, aluminum, lead, nickel, and tin. In modern day, these base metals are literally everywhere. Cars, phones, every electronic tech gizmo, jewelry, everywhere. Makes you think about how 70% of the iron in the human body is found in the hemoglobin proteins of red blood cells, which carry oxygen throughout the body. About 3 to 4 grams of iron overall is found in the human body, distributed throughout hemoglobin, tissues, muscles, bone marrow, blood proteins, enzymes, ferritin, hemosiderin, and transport in plasma. 3 to 4 grams is not a lot, but considering humans have a physical body but are essentially spirits, the minute amounts of iron distributed throughout our bodies may be just enough to imprison our spirits to our fleshy meat suits with minimum damage. Although the end goal seems to be able to ascend our flesh and be in spirit in higher vibrational realms. Think about what happens when humans are too low on iron. It makes you feel exhausted, weak, and dizzy due to reduced oxygen delivery to tissues. Common symptoms include pale skin, cold hands/feet, shortness of breath, headache, brittle nails, and unusual cravings for non-food items like ice, pica. These symptoms often develop gradually, resulting in persistent fatigue and in some cases irritability, anxiety, or restless legs. Yes, untreated severe low iron deficiency anemia can be fatal, although it is rare in developed countries where it is usually identified and treated. It causes death by forcing the heart to overwork to deliver oxygen, leading to dangerous arrhythmias, heart failure, or severe fatigue. Many people actually report that the physical symptoms of low iron, such as fatigue, dizziness, and visual disturbances, are accompanied by heightened sensitivity to or increased sightings of spirits or shadow people. Yes, death can be caused by many things, almost anything. I think the iron keeps our soul and spirit within this meat suit, even though it is only a small amount within us. With the deficiency of iron, it makes sense people would start seeing the spirit realm or the paranormal, because the area becoming less physical based and more spiritual based. Now, let's talk about how Taunton was called Silver City. Silver is also heavily tied to protection against spirits and demons. It's used in talismans, rings, and ritual objects because it's believed to repel or contain entities. The idea is that silver holds a kind of clean or incorruptible frequency. Spirits that feed on chaos, fear, or decay are thought to struggle against it. That's why silver objects are often placed at thresholds, on the body, or around spaces meant to be protected. There's also a deeper symbolic layer. Silver is associated with the moon, and the moon in many traditions governs cycles, reflection, intuition, and hidden truths. Unlike gold, which represents the sun and power, silver represents clarity and darkness. So when it interacts with entities, it doesn't overpower them in a brute force way. It exposes them, disrupts their ability to hide, and interferes with anything unnatural or out of balance. In some traditions, silver even affects fae or trickster entities, not always by harming them, but by limiting their influence or binding them to certain rules. Again, the pattern is the same. Silver enforces order, truth, and boundary. So across folklore, the pattern holds. Silver doesn't just kill monsters. It reveals, purifies, and disrupts what shouldn't be. In combination of an area that was already charged with entities before being disturbed by colonists, silver and iron could create one hell of a disruption, especially in such an area that is already stockpiled with curiosities and energies. It can make it volatile and change the frequencies of the area and the entities. Everything is frequencies. Because remember, the indigenous knew what areas to just respectfully leave the fuck alone and which areas could be encroached upon. But with respect, the colonists dismissed the good and the bad altogether and did what the hell they wanted. Which shows, because otherwise it wouldn't be called the Bridgewater Triangle, sitting up there with the likes of the Bermuda Triangle, Alaskan Triangle, and Dragon's Triangle over there near Tokyo. The block was already hot, but they made the shit explode. There in Bristol County, southeastern Massachusetts, lies the town of Freetown with a population of 9,206 as of the 2020 census. By size and appearance, it reads as a relatively small, quiet New England town, but in regional lore, it sits inside one of the most talked about pockets of strange activity in the state, the Bridgewater Triangle, a name later applied to roughly 200 square miles of southeastern Massachusetts, associated with recurring reports of hauntings, lights, creatures, and other unexplained events. The triangle label itself is modern, but the unease attached to the land is not. The name Freetown itself carries a meaning rooted in its earliest structure, land that was divided among the original purchasers, or freemen, rather than controlled under a single proprietor. In that sense, the free does not mean untouched or unclaimed. It means freehold land, owned outright by those who acquired it. That naming pattern echoes across early New England, where places bearing free in their name often point back to land grants or purchases that gave settlers a rare kind of independence and ownership, even as that land had already belonged to the Wampanoag before being transferred through colonial exchange. Freetown was settled by the English on April 2nd, 1659, on the banks of the Assanet River, and it is one of the older colonial communities in the region. In modern day, it is divided into the two villages that developed along different lines, Assanet and East Freetown. That split is not just a modern convenience. The town's colonial settlement really did grow in two separate nodes, one around Assanet and another around East Freetown, with some distance and limited overland connection between them in the early period. Freetown as a whole, however, was originally part of what became known as the Freemen's Purchase, land acquired from the Wampanoag in 1659. The old payment list is one of those details that makes the whole thing feel even stranger when you sit with it. 20 coats, 2 rugs, 2 iron pots, 2 kettles, 1 little kettle, 8 pairs of shoes, 6 pairs of stockings, 1 dozen hoes, 1 dozen hatchets, and 2 yards of broadcloth. The town's own modern guide still identifies the Freeman's Purchase as the founding land transaction, and older local histories preserve the fuller inventory of goods exchanged. The town seal itself was later said to reference that 1 little kettle. The word freeman in this context is key. It referred to men who held full rights within the colony, including the ability to own land, vote, and participate in civic decisions. The land was not simply settled, it was distributed among these freemen, which is what ultimately gave the town its name. Its colonial population included some of the area's earliest English settlers and their descendants, and the area was shaped by the violence of King Philip's War. The native population in Old Freetown was tied to the wider Pokanoket or Wampanoag world, and King Philip's Cave in East Freetown was later remembered as a native meeting site. During the Revolutionary War, the shoreline of Old Freetown and what is now Fall River was attacked during the 1778 British raids on Mount Hope Bay, placing the area directly inside the conflict. The town in modern day has a total area of about 38.3 square miles, and a large share of the land between Freetown and Fall River is taken up by the Freetown Fall River State Forest. The forest spans thousands of acres with miles of trails cutting through dense woodland, wetlands, and rocky outcrops. It is the kind of place where sound carries strangely, where visibility collapses quickly once you step off the path, and where the terrain itself feels older than the towns built around it. This state forest is the part of Freetown that people keep circling back to, and not only because of legend. Part of its reputation comes from documented crime. In 1978, the body of Mary Lou Aruda, a 15-year-old girl abducted from Rainham, was found tied to a tree in Freetown State Forest. The forest name also became entangled with the fear and rumors surrounding the Fall River murders of 1979 to 1980, a case that later fed into the wider climate of satanic panic in New England. That does not make every story told about ritual activity in the woods true, but it does explain how the forest became permanently associated with something darker than just trees. That is why the forest's reputation sits in this space between the documented and the reported. On one side, there are actual cases, actual bodies, actual investigations. On the other, there are the persistent reports that made the forest infamous well beyond Bristol County. Glowing balls of light, UFO sightings, Bigfoot-like figures, shadowy apparitions, strange serpents, Thunderbird stories, and Puck Woodgie lore. The reports themselves are the phenomenon, repeated enough across enough time that the place has taken on a life beyond what can be proven or disproven outright. One of the features that keeps the forest tied to older layers of meaning is Profile Rock, a massive granite outcrop rising out of the forest floor, weathered into a shape that, from the right angle, forms the unmistakable side profile of a human face. The rock has long been associated in local tradition with Massasoit, the Wampanoag Sachem, who maintained early relations with the Plymouth colonists. For generations, people have stood before it and seen not just a coincidence of erosion, but a presence, forehead, nose, lips, and chin, cut into stone as if intentionally carved, though it is entirely natural. The formation sits elevated above the surrounding land, and when approached through the trees, it appears almost abruptly, like something placed there rather than formed there. Nobody carved it. There's no evidence of human shaping, no tool marks, no alteration. Geologically, it's just granite that has been weathered over a very long period of time. We're talking thousands of years of freeze and thaw cycles, wind erosion, water seeping into cracks and expanding, gradual breaking and reshaping of the rock face. That process is completely normal. What's not normal is the result. Over time, people didn't just see a face in Profile Rock. They began identifying whose face it was, and that identity became tied to Massasoit. The association didn't come from proof or carving, but from recognition and familiarity, as people connected the natural shape of the rock to a historical figure already rooted in that land. Massasoit, whose name was Usama Quinn, was the sachem, a leader or chief of a Native American tribe or confederacy of the Wampanoag Confederacy, and a central figure in early interactions between Native peoples and the Plymouth colonists. He is most known for maintaining a period of alliance and relative peace with the settlers during the early 1600s. His presence and influence in the region made him a natural figure for people to project onto the formation, turning a weathered piece of granite into something that felt tied to memory and identity. They didn't think he was the rock or became the rock, just that it was him symbolically. Also though, if Profile Rock wasn't hand carved, it lends weight to petrified giants theories that surmise that whatever happened back then, huge stone structures and even mountains shaped like animals or with humanoid traits are actually giants turned to stone. In the same lane runs the tale of Jack and the Beanstalk, that it was actually huge trees that reached to the heavens. And when God cut off mankind from the heavens during stories like the Tower of Babel story, it wasn't actually a man-made structure, but humongous trees that reached into the heavens that God had cut and petrified or turned into stone to create the mountains we have today that are now vegetated for the most part. For the Wampanoag, the area around the forest, including nearby sites like King Philip's Cave, was not empty land but part of a lived and spiritual landscape. Later local tradition held that Profile Rock was either a natural likeness of Massasoit or a symbolic marker tied to his presence. Over time, it became a place people visited not just to look, but to stand quietly, to take in the shape, to decide for themselves whether they were seeing a face or something more intentional. The experience of it is part of the story, how different it feels in person than in photographs, how the features seem to sharpen the longer you look. In 2019, part of the rock formation collapsed, altering the clarity of the profile. Even so, the identity of the rock did not disappear with the break. People still refer to it the same way, still walk to it, still photograph it, still debate what exactly they are looking at. That persistence says as much as the formation itself. Because even when the physical shape changes, the meaning attached to it holds. And then there is the wider geography around it. Freetown does not stand alone in this reputation. It sits in a region where nearby places like Hockomock Swamp already carried spiritual and ominous associations long before modern paranormal labels were applied. The name itself has been tied to meanings associated with spirits or forces, and stories connected to the land have been passed down long before they were written down. When a forest like Freetown sits inside a wider landscape already marked by war memory, native history, wetlands, fog, crime, and persistent folklore, it does not take much for it to become the kind of place people talk about in lowered voices. So the reason Freetown Fall River State Forest keeps coming up is not because one single legend made it famous. It is because too many different kinds of stories converge there at once. You have a very old town with a colonial land transaction people still quote down to the kettle. You have land marked by war and native history. You have a massive forest at its center. You have a real crime that permanently marked it. You have nearby cases that fed fear and rumor. And on top of all of that, you have decades of repeated reports, lights, figures, sounds, movements in the trees that continue whether they are explained or not. That combination is what made Freetown State Forest more than just another patch of woods. It became a place people feel before they explain.
I grew up in the Rockland-Abington area, which is at the northernmost tip of the Bridgewater Triangle. While cryptids weren't seen exactly, save for a supposed sighting of the goat eater, a multitude of unnerving situations were experienced by friends and me growing up that directly encouraged us to have an interest in the occult/paranormal, etc. It's hard to describe, but the woods in the area, while lovely and friendly to hikers, always seemed to have a dark, nauseating, heavy energy, which made the experience of being in the forest more stimulating than just having privacy as a youth. Just as a brief overview, many stories of decapitated cats being discovered around town. Personally, finding an occult altar in the woods, a beheaded goat carcass was discovered in the woods behind a cemetery on Webster Street by the police. Friends found a decapitated squirrel head stuck to tree branches in the same woods, all indicating active occult activity, or one or more sick individuals. An odd experience of being in the woods and feeling unnerved as hell, to the point where a friend and I booked it out of there on our bikes, only to hear a lightning-like crack and have a very large, very old, healthy and full-grown tree fall behind us directly along the path towards us to where the treetop missed my friend by about 5 feet, dramatically blocking our re-entrance. A few seconds earlier, and we would have been struck by a random falling tree. If that feeling of substantial dread hadn't preceded this experience, I would have thought it was a massive freak occurrence. But honest to God, we felt we needed to get out of there ASAP. And we weren't in the woods spooking ourselves out. We were having lighthearted conversation when that feeling washed over us. I could go on and on about bizarre personal experiences, but many are subtle feelings of dread, hearing voices, music, etc. in the woods in the area. Just a few things to note about the area. It's suspected to be, or formerly used for, occult purposes. There is an airbase close by that has been linked to suspicious aerial activity. And also, the area has a bizarre history that I am familiar with, as I spent an entire summer poring through old 19th century news archives that I don't think are now available to the public.
I grew up in New Bedford and would go hiking and spend the night out in the Freetown State Forest not far from Profile Rock. My brother and I had experienced things that were not explainable on more than one occasion. This would have occurred between 1990 and 1999. We heard ritualistic drums and chanting one night. Another night, glowing orbs that we thought were other people carrying lanterns or high-powered flashlights. There were no people. Upon checking it out, they just faded away before our eyes. Never mind the screams you would hear in the dead of night carried by the darkness. On another occasion, this still haunts me to this day. We were hiking in what I can only describe as the darkest night imaginable with limited light sources, and as we were hiking along a path to our right, we heard something breaking brush and tree branches charging toward us in the pitch black. Whatever it was, massive and heavy, and as it charged, it let out this otherworldly, demonic growl, which is the only way to describe it. I now live in Seattle, Washington, and I am 37 and an avid hiker, and I've heard everything from cougars, elk, caribou, wolves, and bears, pretty much most big game. And this was none of those. My brother, with a baseball bat in hand, charged that wood line, swinging and yelling, and just like that, the night fell dead silent. Not a cricket, not a sound, just the sound of our hearts beating out of our chests.
For starters, if you don't know what the Bridgewater Triangle is, think of it as the Bermuda Triangle on land, so that you can imagine the weirdness. The first story takes place on a night when my girl and I were smoking out the window of her apartment. She's on the top floor. It's a quiet night, about maybe 11 or 12, and my girl and I are getting ready to smoke before bed. As I'm on my phone trying to get it to work, my connection was bad. My girl says to me, "What's that?" And as I look out the window, there's a pitch metal black triangle spaceship just slowly moving across the sky while sort of spinning. It was really, really strange because it came and went, even though it was moving incredibly slowly, almost like a cloud moving in the sky on a windy day. The second story takes place around the same time, but a month later, again, my girl and I are getting ready to smoke before bed, and we both notice one brightish white orb in the sky. It flies to this one specific place, then more start joining the area. After this, it continues with many orbs, and they all start going directly up into the sky like a dragonfly in a single file. The third story is now another month later, and it only happened to me. It was like 2 a.m, and I woke up to hearing a bunch of birds tweeting and almost screaming outside. 'Cause we smoke, we always had the window open a little. As I'm waking up, I hear this noise that sounds like a gorilla mixed with a dragon, like a screech mixed with a roar or a howl, and the animals went even crazier. After 3 minutes of weird roaring, birds and other animals screaming, it all went quiet, and funny enough, my girl woke up like she came out of a trance and already knew something had happened. It was weird. The last story takes place again at night, but my girl heard it too. It's 3 a.m, and we're up because we're binge watching some show or something like that when we hear this flute. Now, when I say a flute, I mean something you'd hear in an ancient ritual. It was very mystical and powerful sounding. After this, the flute started, and the wind outside began howling and gusting like a hurricane. Then by 4, the flute played its last note, and the wind calmed down. It felt very strange. It was like when the flute stopped, nature stopped with it.
Now, I don't know if he was high off whatever and just was seeing things, or if he was high and actually seeing things for what they were. Interesting story though. It reminds me of the experiences that happens all throughout the rest of the Appalachian Mountains. This next story is called The Black Dog of the Bridgewater Triangle. The story of the Black Dog in the Bridgewater Triangle begins in 1976 in Abington, Massachusetts, a town located within the boundaries of the Triangle, a region already known for reports of strange creatures, UFO sightings, and unexplained phenomena. What sets this case apart from many others is that it did not begin as a vague or fleeting sighting. It began with something physical, something violent, and something that immediately drew the attention of both residents and authorities. In the spring of that year, a local resident went out early in the morning to check on his livestock. What he found was disturbing. 2 of his ponies were lying dead, their throats completely torn out in a way that did not resemble typical animal predation. In some retellings, it is emphasized that there was little sign of the animals being consumed, suggesting that the attack was focused more on killing than feeding, though this detail varies depending on the source. Standing over them was a large black dog, described as being significantly bigger than an ordinary domestic animal. Some accounts compare compare it to a German Shepherd or Doberman, but with an exaggerated size and presence that made it feel unnatural. The animal was reportedly covered in blood and actively feeding when it was discovered. When confronted, it did not react in the frantic or defensive way one might expect from a wild predator. Instead, it retreated calmly into the surrounding woods, disappearing into the swampy terrain that borders much of the area. The incident quickly spread throughout the town, and fear escalated. Reports of sightings began to increase, with residents claiming to see a large black dog moving through neighborhoods, wooded areas, and near roads. Some of these sightings appeared to occur within time frames and distances that led people to speculate that there may have been more than one animal, while others believed the growing panic contributed to misidentification and exaggeration. Regardless, the sense of threat was real. Children were kept indoors, residents became more cautious, and local authorities began actively searching for the animal. The most well-known encounter occurred when a police officer reportedly located the animal near a set of railroad tracks. The dog was described as moving slowly along the tracks, not hiding or fleeing, but walking with a calm, almost deliberate pace. When the officer fired his weapon, he missed. What made the moment unsettling was not just the missed shot, but the animal's reaction. It did not run, panic, or retaliate. It simply continued moving, as if the attempt to stop it had no consequence. Some versions of the story suggest the officer perceived a strange awareness in the animal, as though it recognized the situation but chose not to respond to it in any typical way. Shortly after, it disappeared into the surrounding woods and was never located again. Additional reports from that time introduced details that pushed the story beyond that of a dangerous animal and into something more ambiguous. Some witnesses described the dog as having glowing eyes, though the color varies depending on the account: red, yellow, or reflective, like an animal caught in light. Others described an unnatural stillness in the way it moved, or claimed it made little to no sound, even when traveling through brush or debris. There are also accounts suggesting that its size appeared inconsistent, seeming larger up close than at a distance. While none of these details are officially verified, they appear repeatedly enough in retellings to become part of the broader narrative. For several days, and in some accounts up to about a week, Abington remained in a heightened state of fear. Sightings were reported across different parts of town, sometimes within short intervals that made the animal's movement seem unusually fast or difficult to track. Despite active searches, no definitive physical evidence was recovered that led to identification or capture. No remains of the animal were found, no confirmed tracks tied conclusively to a specific species, and no additional attacks of the same scale were officially documented after the initial incident. Eventually, the sightings stopped as suddenly as they had begun. On its own, the incident could be interpreted as a case of a large stray or wild animal combined with heightened community anxiety. However, its location within the Bridgewater Triangle places it within a larger pattern of reported phenomena in the region. The Triangle, which includes areas like Abington and nearby sites such as the Hockomock Swamp, has long been associated with reports of phantom animals, shadow figures, and unexplained lights. Within that context, the black dog becomes more than an isolated event. It aligns with a recurring theme of entities that appear briefly, interact with the physical world, and then disappear without resolution. In folklore across multiple cultures, black dogs are often described as boundary figures, entities associated with liminal spaces, meaning places that exist in between states, such as forests, roads, crossroads, thresholds, and other transitional environments where one space becomes another. These are areas that are neither fully one thing nor the other, and in many traditions they are believed to be points where the normal rules of reality feel thinner or less stable. A well-known example of this idea appears in voodoo traditions, where individuals may seek to encounter Papa Legba at the crossroads. Papa Legba is understood as a gatekeeper between worlds, a spirit who controls access between the human realm and the spiritual realm, opening and closing the path of communication. Without him, nothing passes between those spaces. In some interpretations and regional accounts, he is said to appear in different forms, including as an old man, a child, or occasionally as a black dog, reinforcing the connection between black dog figures and liminal transitional spaces. In this sense, black dogs are not always simply creatures, but symbols or manifestations tied to moments of crossing, change, and access between states of being. They are sometimes viewed as omens, guardians, or presences connected to disruption or transformation. The Abington incident mirrors many of these patterns, from its sudden and violent appearance to its equally abrupt disappearance. The 1976 Black Dog case remains one of the more grounded yet unresolved events connected to the Bridgewater Triangle. It involved physical evidence, multiple witnesses, and direct law enforcement interaction. Yet, it ended without explanation. No definitive identification was ever made, and the animal itself was never found. What remains is a story that exists between documented event and evolving folklore, shaped not only by what was seen, but by what was never fully understood, and perhaps, more importantly, what was never found. I did a little more digging and found a post in the Bridgewater Triangle Facebook group where someone asked if anyone had ever seen the demonic black dog again after the 1976 attack in Abington, followed by a clipping of a newspaper article and a picture of a black dog. The post was made in March of 2023, and there are two comments that piqued my interest. One person said that in 1978 they were heading south towards Middleborough, Massachusetts from Summer Street, just before the correctional facility where there were cornfields on each side. In daylight from the left out of the cornfield, a black dog the size of a small horse came to the edge of the road. Naturally, it gave this person and their friend quite the scare. To describe the black dog's size, they said to imagine the largest Cane Corso dog and triple its size. They stepped on the gas and saw it standing partially in the road, staring at them in the rear view mirror. Wow. Then there was another commenter that posted a screenshot of a Reddit post addressing the question. It is titled The Black Dog of Abington and reads as follows. I used to work security with an older man. To pass time, we talk about what guys talked about: women, whiskey, politics, and we would share hunting and fishing stories. There is one story from him I will always remember. Back in the 1980s, he was camping near some woods out in Abington, Massachusetts, with a couple of friends. While they were camping, they heard a god-awful screeching noise. They ran out to check out the noise, and about 50 yards away from them, they saw bright glowing eyes and the outline of a dark creature close to 6 feet tall standing on all fours. The way he described it to me was as if he was reliving it, seeing terror on his own face. They reported it to the local police. They didn't exactly know what they saw. The police, however, knew what it was: the black dog. It was first seen about 10 years earlier. A firefighter witnessed it after it mutilated 2 of his horses. A day later, a police officer saw the dog along the train tracks, took a shot at it, but missed as it walked into the forest as if nothing happened. 2 town officials reported seeing this creature and even shot at. While the Pukwudgie Little People and the Bridgewater Triangle will always remain the most plentiful in terms of human encounters, the other strongest non-dog creature story in the Triangle is probably the giant bird report tied to Norton Police Sergeant Thomas Downey. In Triangle lore, Downey is repeatedly described as a respected police sergeant who reported seeing an enormous bird-like creature in 1971 near the edge of the Hockomock area. The story is usually told this way. He was driving home late at night or in the early morning hours when he saw a towering creature at the roadside or swamp edge. He described it as bird-like but far too large to be normal, standing over 6 feet high with a wingspan often given as roughly 8 to 12 feet. In the retellings, the creature then rose abruptly into the air and disappeared. That sighting matters because it gave the Triangle one of its most famous Thunderbird accounts, and because the witness was not presented as a random storyteller but as law enforcement. Still, it has to be said plainly that what survives publicly is the retelling of the report, not a modern, easily inspectable police file. So the Thunderbird story is central to the Triangle's mythology, but it lives more as a repeatedly cited local account than as a fully documented solved case. What makes the Thunderbird story interesting is that it does not stand alone. Broader summaries of Bridgewater Triangle lore repeatedly mention giant birds, or even pterodactyl-like creatures seen in Hockomock Swamp and neighboring towns like Taunton and Easton. That does not prove one single animal was ever there, but it does show that Downey's sighting became part of a larger pattern rather than an isolated anecdote. Even modern discussion threads still echo that same image: a huge, dark flying thing, usually seen at night, often described as too big for any local bird. The repetition is important. In folklore, repeated shape matters as much as a single event. Here, the recurring shape is not simply large bird, but unnaturally large bird appearing over swamp and woodland edges, which is exactly the kind of liminal setting where Bridgewater stories tend to happen. The next major category is the Bigfoot-like creature. This is harder to pin to one definitive historical incident than the Thunderbird or Black Dog, because the reports tend to be scattered and cumulative rather than anchored to one famous date. Mainstream summaries of the triangle consistently include Bigfoot-like sightings in the Hockomock Swamp area, and Lauren Coleman has also linked swampy and wooded parts of Massachusetts, including Hockomock, to reports of upright, hairy humanoids. In other words, the Bigfoot element is not an afterthought. It is one of the core creature types in the triangle tradition. What is less stable are the details. Public retellings describe hulking, ape-like figures seen briefly near tree lines, in wetlands, or along roads. The reports often stress bulk, height, and sudden disappearance, but they do not resolve into one single canonical case the way the Black Dog story does. Modern anecdotal accounts help show why the Bigfoot thread persists, even if they do not count as proof. In one Reddit discussion, a commenter describing the Hockomock area said they thought they may have had a Bigfoot encounter at dusk after noticing an overwhelming smell and hearing something large crashing through swamp growth. In another, two people doing nighttime photography near Hockomock described seeing eyes in the trees and hearing a large, disturbing noise that they interpreted as almost human, mimicking an animal. The giant snake tradition is even older feeling and even less tied to one famous single event. Standard summaries of the Bridgewater Triangle regularly list giant snakes among the area's reported anomalies, especially around Hockomock Swamp. Local library and folklore collections repeat the idea that enormous snakes have been part of the region's lore for decades. The swamp carries associations with hidden water channels, reeds, mud, and partial visibility. The giant snake fits the environment almost perfectly. Phantom big cats, especially Black Panther-like animals, belong in the same category. Older Bridgewater Triangle materials and public library scans tied to Lauren Coleman's work mention great cats, lions, and phantom panthers as part of the region's recurring creature lore. This is actually a useful case because it sits right on the border between cryptid narrative and ordinary misidentification. Big cat reports show up in many parts of New England, often in places where no breeding population is officially recognized. And then there is the overlap between creature stories and sky phenomena. Mainstream descriptions of the Bridgewater Triangle almost always pair cryptid reports with UFOs, bright balls of light, and unusual aerial sightings. That overlap matters because it changes the tone of the region. Among the lesser defined but consistently described phenomena within the Bridgewater Triangle are encounters with tall, thin, stick-like figures seen deep within wooded areas, particularly around Hockomock Swamp. They are described as unnaturally tall, extremely thin, and often indistinguishable from the surrounding trees at first glance. Witnesses frequently report that the figure does not immediately stand out. Instead, it is perceived slowly, as if the mind begins to recognize that something in the environment is shaped incorrectly. What appears to be a tree trunk or a cluster of branches begins to take on the outline of a humanoid form, standing motionless among the forest. One account describes an individual walking near the edge of Hockomock Swamp at dusk, when visibility was low but not completely dark. As they moved along the tree line, they became aware of a shape ahead that seemed taller than the surrounding brush. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than a thin tree, but after a few seconds, the realization set in that the shape did not match the others. It was too straight, too narrow, and positioned slightly forward from the natural line of trees. As the witness stopped, the figure appeared to shift, not in a dramatic movement, but in a subtle repositioning, as if it had leaned or adjusted its stance. The moment direct focus was placed on it, the figure was no longer clearly visible. It did not run or retreat in a visible way. It simply was not there in the same form anymore. The witness described an immediate and overwhelming feeling of being watched, not from one direction, but from the surrounding area as a whole, as if the environment itself had become aware of their presence. Other accounts follow a similar pattern. Individuals describe seeing elongated shapes standing among trees, often just outside of clear vision. When attention is directed toward the figure, it either disappears or blends back into the environment in a way that feels unnatural. Some describe the figure as having no clear facial features, only the suggestion of a head and limbs formed by shadow and negative space. There are also reports of these figures appearing closer than expected, as if distance is difficult to judge when observing them. In certain cases, witnesses have reported that the figures seem to unfold or straighten, becoming taller than initially perceived. These encounters make me think about the stick Indians of Pacific Northwest traditions, and the stories about people seeing trees walk. The similarities in description are difficult to ignore. Within the broader pattern of the Bridgewater Triangle, these stick-like figures fit into a recurring theme, entities that do not fully reveal themselves. They are seen briefly, often indirectly, and are rarely observed long enough to be clearly defined. They occupy the edges of perception, existing in that space where something is present but never fully understood. Unlike more defined cryptids, they do not leave behind physical evidence, nor do they engage in direct interaction. Instead, they remain part of the environment itself, appearing only when noticed and disappearing just as quickly. There are some that believe all the phenomena surrounding the Bridgewater Triangle have been hyped up more than necessary, making the area a thing, if you will. What do you think?